My daughter told me my father died of a heart attack while I was away. The grief was unbearable. The coffin was closed at the funeral. A year passed. One day, arriving unannounced for a visit, I heard a familiar cough coming from behind the locked basement door. "It's just old pipes," my daughter said, turning pale. But I knew that cough. I had lived with him for 40 years. If you're ready for this journey, make sure you hit that subscribe button and give this a like so you don't miss the updates. And let me know in the comments what city you're watching from. It's always lovely to see where everyone is. My name is Helen, and for 41 years, I was married to Richard Miller. Or at least, I thought I was. We had the kind of marriage that people write novels about, or so it seemed from the outside. We weren't flashy people. We lived in a modest 3-bedroom ranch house in Ohio, the same one we bought when our daughter, Sarah, was just a toddler. Richard was an accountant, a man of numbers and quiet routines. I was a second-grade teacher. Our lives were painted in reliable, comforting shades of beige. He liked his coffee black, his newspaper delivered by 6 a.m., and the thermostat at a firm 70 degrees. I knew the sound of his footsteps on the hardwood floors, the specific sigh he made when he was tired, and the low, rattling cough that signaled the start of his annual winter bronchitis. We were predictable, and I loved that. I found safety in it. The end, or what I was told was the end, came on a Tuesday in October. I was visiting my sister Carol in Arizona for a week. It was our annual tradition, a little dose of sunshine before the long Ohio winter set in. Richard always hated to fly, so he stayed behind, promising to hold down the fort. I remember our last phone call vividly. He sounded fine, maybe a little tired. He told me he was watching an old John Wayne movie and had just finished the last of the lasagna I'd left for him. "Hurry home, sweetie," he'd said. "It's too quiet here without you." The next morning, my world fell apart. The call came from Sarah, my daughter. I heard the manufactured tears in her voice before she even said the words, "Mom, it's Dad." My blood went cold. She said the neighbor, Mr. Henderson, had found him. He'd noticed the morning paper was still on the porch around noon and got worried. He had a spare key. He found Richard on the sofa, the TV remote still in his hand. "A massive, sudden heart attack," she said. The doctors told her he wouldn't have felt a thing. Grief is a fog. It rolls in and obscures everything, muffling sounds and blurring the edges of reality. The flight home was a blur. My son-in-law, Mark, a man I'd always found a bit too slick, a bit too eager to please, met me at the airport. He steered me through the terminal, his hand on my elbow, speaking in those hushed, solemn tones people use when they don't know what else to say. He and Sarah had taken care of everything, he assured me. The funeral home, the arrangements. They didn't want me to have to worry. At the time, I was grateful. Looking back, I see it for what it was, the first move in a grand deception, controlling the narrative from the very beginning. The funeral was just 3 days later. It felt rushed, frantic even. Sarah insisted on a closed casket. "It's better this way, Mom," she'd whispered, hugging me tightly. "You should remember him the way he was, healthy, smiling, not like that." Her reasoning seemed sound, born of a daughter's love for her mother's well-being. My sister Carol flew in, and she too thought it was a tender mercy. Why would I question it? When your world has been shattered, you cling to the hands that offer to help you pick up the pieces. You don't inspect them for dirt under the fingernails. I stood before that polished oak box, a photo of Richard from our last anniversary propped up beside it, and I said goodbye to a ghost. We buried an empty coffin. I just didn't know it yet. The first year was the hardest. Every morning I woke up, and for a split second I'd forget. I'd roll over to say something to Richard, only to be met with the cold, empty space beside me. The house, once a source of comfort, became a museum of my grief. His favorite coffee mug was in the dish drainer. His reading glasses were on the nightstand. His scent lingered on the worn leather of his recliner. I was adrift in a sea of memories. Sarah and Mark were, on the surface, wonderfully supportive. They called every day. They brought over groceries. But something was off. About 3 months after the funeral, they bought a new house. A huge 5-bedroom monstrosity in a gated community. The kind of place Richard and I used to drive by and shake our heads at, wondering who on earth needed that much space. When I questioned the expense, Mark just smiled that slippery smile of his. My big promotion at work came through, Helen. And, a few of Richard's investments paid out after he passed. He was always smarter than he let on. It seemed plausible enough. Richard handled all our finances. He was meticulous, and it was certainly possible he'd squirreled away more than I knew. Then came the new cars. A gleaming black Cadillac for Mark and a sporty little Lexus SUV for Sarah. And designer clothes. Lavish vacations they posted all over social media. My daughter, who used to shop at Kohl's and clip coupons, was suddenly carrying a Louis Vuitton handbag. The gap between their newfound wealth and my modest life on Richard's pension and my social security started to feel like a chasm. When I'd gently inquire, the answer was always the same. Mark's killing it at work. Or, Dad's portfolio was a goldmine, Mom. He set us up for life. They made it sound like Richard's final act of love was to make them rich, and my questioning it was somehow ungrateful. And just when he thought he had me backed into a corner, he forgot who he was dealing with. Stick with me, because you'll want to see how this plays out. The nagging feeling in the pit of my stomach grew. It was more than just the money. Sarah changed. She was jumpy, always checking her phone. Our conversations, once easy and flowing, became stilted. It felt like she was hiding something, constantly on guard. She started limiting when I could visit, insisting I call first. The new house is just so big, Mom, and I'm always running around. I want to make sure I'm here and can give you my full attention, she'd say. It sounded reasonable, but it felt like a wall being built, brick by brick. The truth is, grief is isolating. You start to doubt your own sanity. You think, maybe it's just me. Maybe I'm resentful of their happiness because I've lost mine. Maybe I'm just a lonely old woman becoming a burden. I tried to push the suspicions away, to be happy for them, to believe the story they were selling. It was easier than confronting the alternative, which was too monstrous to even contemplate. The day it all unraveled was a Tuesday, almost a year to the day since Richard's death. I'd had a particularly rough morning, a wave of loneliness washing over me so intensely I could barely breathe. I decided to do something normal. I baked Richard's favorite apple pie. The smell of cinnamon and apples always made the house feel less empty. As I pulled it from the oven, golden and fragrant, I had a sudden urge. I wanted to see my daughter. I wanted a hug. I didn't want to call first and give her the chance to put me off. I wanted, just for once, for things to be like they used to be. I drove the 20 minutes to their new neighborhood, a place with pretentious names like the Estates at Willow Creek. I pulled into their curving cobblestone driveway and walked up to the grand front door, the warm pie in my hands. I rang the bell. Nothing. I rang it again. I knew Sarah's car was in the driveway. I tried the doorknob, and surprisingly, it was unlocked. I let myself in, calling out, "Sarah, honey, it's Mom, I brought pie." The house was silent. It was immaculately clean, like a model home. Cold, sterile, not a single thing out of place. It didn't feel lived in. I put the pie on the giant granite island in the kitchen and called out again, "Sarah?"
I heard a floorboard creak upstairs. A few moments later, Sarah appeared at the top of the grand, sweeping staircase. She was wearing a silk robe, and her face was sheet white. She looked like she'd seen a ghost. "Mom, what are you doing here? You should have called." Her voice was tight, sharp, with an emotion I couldn't quite place. It wasn't annoyance. It was panic. "I just wanted to surprise you, honey. I brought your favorite pie." I tried to sound cheerful, but the coldness of her greeting put a knot in my stomach. "You can't just show up like this," she stammered, walking slowly down the stairs, her eyes darting around as if looking for an intruder. I wasn't feeling well. I was resting." "Oh, I'm sorry. I can go," I started to say, feeling foolish. And then I heard it.
From the far side of the main floor, near the back of the house, came a sound that stopped the breath in my lungs. It was a cough. A deep, wet, rattling cough. A cough so intimately familiar that I felt it in my bones. It was the sound of Richard's winter bronchitis. My head snapped in the direction of the sound, towards a closed door under the staircase. "What was that?" I asked, my voice barely a whisper. Sarah's face, if possible, got even paler. She forced a brittle laugh. "Oh, that? It's just the pipes. This new house, it makes the craziest noises. The plumber said it's the sump pump kicking on." I stared at her. "Pipes don't cough, Sarah." "You're being silly, Mom. It's an old house, settling, you know?" She started walking towards me, trying to guide me back towards the front door. "Let's cut a slice of that pie, and you can take it with you. Mark will be so thrilled." I didn't move. I stood frozen, my ears straining. And then it came again, louder this time, a hacking cough followed by a low, pained groan. I knew that groan. It was the sound he made when his back seized up. For 40 years, I had brought him heating pads and ibuprofen when I heard that groan. It wasn't the house settling. It wasn't a sump pump. It was my husband. I pulled away from Sarah's grasp and walked slowly, deliberately, toward the basement door. "Mom? Don't," Sarah pleaded, her voice cracking. "There's nothing down there. It's just storage. It's a mess." I reached the door. It was solid wood, with a heavy-duty deadbolt lock on it. A new one, the brass still shiny and unscratched. Why would you need a deadbolt lock on an interior basement door? I looked at my daughter, whose face was now a mask of pure, unadulterated terror. "Open it, Sarah," I said, my voice dangerously quiet. "I can't. Mark has the key. He keeps his tools and stuff down there. He's paranoid about someone stealing them." The lie was so clumsy, so transparent, it was almost insulting. "Pipes," I repeated, my gaze fixed on her. "You told me he died of a heart attack. You let me bury him. You let me grieve for a year. My heart wasn't breaking anymore. It was turning into a cold, hard stone in my chest." I placed my hand on the doorknob, and then I looked my only child in the eye. "I know that cough. I lived with your father for 40 years. Sarah's face crumpled. A pathetic sob escaped her lips. "Mom, please, just leave it. Let's go have some pie. We can talk." I felt a strange sense of detachment, as if I were watching a scene in a movie. My hands weren't even shaking. All the grief, all the sleepless nights, all the tears shed over the past year, it was all coalescing into a single, cold point of clarity. I was no longer a grieving widow. I was a woman on the verge of a terrible truth. "If you don't open this door, Sarah, I'm going to call the police. I'll tell them I'm at my daughter's house and I can hear a man locked in the basement, coughing and in distress. I'll say I think he's being held against his will." "What do you think will happen then?" I asked. My voice was as calm and steady as if I were asking her to pass the salt at the dinner table. That was the magic word, police. The color drained completely from her face, leaving a pasty grayish pallor. She looked from my face to the dead-bolted door, her mind frantically trying to find an exit from a room that had none. The jig was up, and she knew it. With a trembling hand, she reached into the pocket of her silk robe and pulled out a key. It looked ridiculously small for the damage it was about to do. The deadbolt made a heavy, sickening clunk as she turned it. She pulled the door open just a crack, as if she could somehow contain the truth from spilling out. She tried to block my way, her body language a desperate plea. "Mom, just let me explain first." I gently but firmly moved her aside and stepped through the doorway onto a small landing. At the bottom of a short flight of wooden stairs was a room, not a storage space, not a messy basement. It was a makeshift apartment. There was a single bed, neatly made, a mini fridge hummed in the corner next to a microwave. A large flat-screen television was mounted on the wall, and next to it a comfortable-looking armchair. And sitting in that armchair, a book open on his lap, was my husband, Richard. He looked thinner, paler. The vibrant, healthy glow I remembered from my last photos of him was gone, replaced by the sallow complexion of someone who hadn't seen the sun in a long time. He was wearing an expensive-looking sweatsuit and a new pair of slippers. He looked up at the sound of the door opening, his expression shifting from mild annoyance to pure, slack-jawed shock. His reading glasses slipped down his nose. The book fell from his lap and landed on the carpet with a soft thud. For a moment, nobody spoke. The only sound was the humming of the mini-fridge and the frantic beating of my own heart, which now felt like it was hammering against my ribs, demanding to be let out. He stared at me. I stared at him. The man I had mourned. The man I had eulogized. The man I had buried in a cemetery plot we had picked out together 15 years ago. "Helen," he breathed, his voice a hoarse croak. And just like that, the spell was broken. I walked down the stairs, each step firm, deliberate. I felt Sarah's presence behind me, a whirlwind of panicked energy, but my focus was entirely on him. I stopped a few feet in front of his chair. I took in the scene. The neat little prison, paid for with my grief. The man in the chair, a ghost made of flesh and greed. "Heart attack, was it?" I asked, my voice still eerily calm. "Sudden? Painless?" "That's what they told me." Richard fungled to his feet. "Helen, sweetheart, let me explain. It's not what you think." "Isn't it?" I swept my gaze around the room. "You know, for a dead man, you've kept the place quite tidy." "Mom, we were going to tell you," Sarah blurted out from the top of the stairs. We were just waiting for the right time." "The right time?" I laughed, a bitter, hollow sound. "Was it going to be after your next European vacation? After you bought another car? A year, Sarah. I cried every single day for a year. I talked to his picture on the mantelpiece. I left flowers on an empty grave. When exactly was the right time going to be?" "We did it for you, Mom," she said, her voice dripping with a self-serving pity that turned my stomach. "For all of us." I know this part is hard to hear, but it's important. The truth was about to come out, and it was going to be glorious. I turned my back on Richard and looked up at my daughter, my only child. "Explain it to me then. Explain how faking your father's death, defrauding an insurance company, and letting your mother live in a hell of her own grief for a year was for me." And so they did. The story came tumbling out, a waterfall of disgusting, self-serving lies, with Mark, the slick, smarmy son-in-law, at the center of it. Apparently, a few years back, Mark had convinced Richard to take out a massive life insurance policy, a $3 million policy. "Just as an investment, Helen, for your future," Richard mumbled, not quite meeting my eyes. Richard's accounting firm had been hit hard in a bad market, and he was nearing retirement with far less than he had planned. He was facing the prospect of working until he dropped or living a severely downgraded lifestyle. He was terrified of being poor. So Mark, the brilliant financial advisor, hatched a plan. A doctor he knew, a man who had since conveniently fled the country, was willing to sign a fraudulent death certificate for a price. They bought a casket. They staged the discovery. They held a funeral. And when the $3 million check from the insurance company arrived, they split it. One half for Sarah and Mark to start their fabulous new life, the other half for Richard, who would live in secret in their basement until the heat was off and he could be quietly moved to a country with no extradition treaty to live out his days on a beach somewhere. His pension was collapsing, she whined. We were going to lose everything. Dad didn't want you to have to worry about money in your old age. This way, you were taken care of. The house is paid off. You have his pension. My old age? I said, cutting her off. I was going to have my husband. We were going to grow old together. That was the plan. Not for me to sit alone in an empty house with a pile of blood money. It wasn't blood money, Helen, Richard said, finally finding a sliver of his old patronistic tone. It was smart. It was a business decision. A bit unorthodox, maybe, but... Unorthodox? I wheeled around to face him. You let me think you were dead. My husband, the man I shared my bed with for 40 years, the father of my child, let me collapse in a heap of sorrow, thinking he was gone forever, and it was a business decision? For the first time, I felt the ice around my heart crack, and a hot, searing rage flooded through me. I looked at him, really looked at him, and I didn't see the man I married. I saw a weak, pathetic stranger, a coward who would rather betray his family than face his own failures. I looked at the new, expensive-looking watch on his wrist, and then up at my daughter, huddled at the top of the stairs in her $1,000 robe. They had traded my life for trinkets.
I took a deep breath, and the coldness returned, more solid this time. It was a foundation. I could build on it. I looked at Richard, I looked at Sarah, and then I turned and walked back up the stairs. "Mom, wait, where are you going?" Sarah cried, trying to grab my arm. I shook her off without a word. I walked through her cold, soulless designer house, past the oversized furniture and the sterile art on the walls. I went into the kitchen and picked up the apple pie I'd left on the counter. The smell of cinnamon and baked apples, once a scent of comfort and love, now smelled like deceit. I walked to the front door, pie in hand, and opened it. "Helen, please!" Richard's voice echoed from the basement. "Don't do anything stupid!" I paused in the doorway, my back to them. I could feel their desperate eyes on me. I didn't turn around. I simply said, the stupid thing was thinking I wouldn't find out. And I walked out, closing the door softly behind me. I got in my car, placed the pie on the passenger seat, and drove away. I didn't speed. I didn't run a single red light. On the outside, I was a calm 66-year-old woman driving home from her daughter's house. On the inside, a war was being planned. The fog of grief had lifted completely, and in its place was a crystal-clear blue sky of pure, unadulterated resolve. They thought they had buried me under the weight of my own sorrow. They had no idea they had just planted a seed. That 20-minute drive home felt like an eternity. The apple pie on the passenger seat seemed to mock me with its sweet, homey scent. It represented everything I thought my life was: wholesome, loving, built on a foundation of shared memories and simple truths. When I got home, the first thing I did was walk straight to the kitchen trash can and scrape the entire pie into it. It was a small, symbolic act, but it felt momentous. The old Helen, the trusting, pie-baking Helen, was gone. She died in that basement. A new woman was driving now. I sat at my kitchen table, The one where Richard and I had shared thousands of meals and I didn't cry. The time for tears was over. Now was the time for strategy. They had played me for a fool, a fragile old woman easily manipulated by her own emotions. They used my love and my grief as a tool to get what they wanted. They underestimated me, and they were about to regret that for the rest of their lives. My first call wasn't to the police. It was to my sister, Carol. Carol was a retired paralegal, a sharp, no-nonsense woman with a mind like a steel trap and a deep-seated distrust of Mark, my son-in-law. She'd always called him Smilin' Mark, saying, "A man who smiles that much when he ain't selling you something is a man with something to hide." How right she was. I told her everything. She was silent for a long moment after I finished, and I could practically hear the gears turning in her head all the way from Arizona. When she finally spoke, her voice was low and dangerous. That son of a bitch. I never trusted him. Or Richard, for that matter. Always a little too pleased with himself. There was no, "Are you sure?" No, "Maybe you misunderstood." Carol knew I wasn't prone to hysterics. "Okay, Helen," she said, her voice shifting into full-on professional mode. "Listen to me, and listen carefully. Do not contact them. Do not answer their calls or texts. Let them sweat. They don't know what you're going to do, and that fear is our first weapon. Secondly, you need a lawyer, not just any lawyer. You need a shark. I know a guy. His name is Ben Carter. He eats slick-haired little pricks like Mark for breakfast. I'll make the call." The next 24 hours were a blur of panicked, tearful voicemails and hundreds of texts from Sarah. "Mom, please call me. We can fix this. Don't ruin our lives. Think of your grandson." That last one almost made me laugh. My grandson, little 8-year-old Josh, who they were clearly raising to be just as morally bankrupt as them. They didn't care about Josh's well-being when they decided to commit a multi-million-dollar fraud. His name was just a pawn they were now trying to use against me.
I followed Carol's advice and ignored them completely. Instead, I gathered evidence. Richard had been so certain of my grief-induced stupor that he'd gotten sloppy. In his home office, which I had preserved as a shrine to his memory, I found bank statements I'd never seen before. Hidden in the back of a file cabinet was a folder detailing offshore accounts, opened just weeks before his death. He had been moving assets, preparing for his grand disappearing act. I photocopied everything. The next day, I met Ben Carter. He was exactly what you'd expect a lawyer nicknamed the Shark to be. He was in his 50s with a tailored suit, an expensive haircut, and eyes that missed nothing. I walked into his mahogany-paneled office feeling like a frumpy, retired schoolteacher and laid my story out. I gave him the details, the bank statements, the timeline. When I was finished, he leaned back in his leather chair and didn't say a word for a full minute. I thought he was going to tell me I was crazy. Instead, a slow, predatory grin spread across his face. "Mrs. Miller," he said, "this is the most beautifully brazen case of insurance fraud and conspiracy I have ever seen. They built a cage for themselves, and you are holding the key." He laid out the plan. It was elegant, it was vicious, and it was perfect. He explained that if we went straight to the police, Richard, Mark, and Sarah would be arrested. The insurance money would be frozen as evidence. It would be tied up in courts for years, and after the legal battles, the government seizures, and the fines, I might see pennies on the dollar. "Justice isn't always about seeing them in jail, Helen," Ben explained, his eyes glinting. "Sometimes true justice is taking everything from them, just like they took everything from you, and leaving them with the mess they made." He was about to get exactly what he deserved, and I had a front row seat. Don't go anywhere. The first step was to turn the screws. Ben drafted a letter. It was a masterpiece of legal threat, delivered by courier not to their fancy new house, but to Mark's high-powered investment firm. It was addressed to Mark directly, but worded so that any junior partner or secretary opening it would get the gist. The letter outlined, in excruciating detail, the entirety of their scheme. The fake death, the fraudulent certificate, the basement apartment, the offshore accounts with account numbers included. It mentioned violations of state and federal law, naming specific statutes for mail fraud, wire fraud, and insurance fraud. The potential prison time for each offense was listed in bold print. Then came the demand, the $3 million insurance payout, plus damages for emotional distress, pain, and suffering. A grand total of $4.5 million. It was to be wired to a trust account controlled by Ben's firm within 72 hours. If the deadline passed, the letter concluded, an identical copy of this correspondence, along with all supporting documentation, would be delivered to the State Insurance Commissioner's Office, the IRS Criminal Investigation Division, and the District Attorney's Office. We won't get it all, Ben warned me. But the goal isn't just the money. The goal is to detonate a bomb in the middle of their perfect new life. He was right. The fallout was immediate. Mark's firm, a stuffy old money institution that prized its reputation above all else, caught wind of it. He was suspended pending an internal investigation, which was corporate speak for clean out your desk. The news must have ripped through their gated community like a wildfire. Suddenly, the flashy new couple with the mysterious windfall was toxic. The panicked calls from Sarah intensified, but now they were laced with anger. How could you do this to us? You're destroying our family. Mark could lose his job. I just let the voicemails pile up. My sister Carol listened to one and snorted. Sounds like she's upset she got caught, not that she did anything wrong.
Of course, they didn't have $4.5 million liquid. They had spent a good chunk of it on the house, the cars, and a lifestyle they couldn't afford. They called Ben, blustering and threatening countersuits. Ben just laughed. "Bring it on," he'd told Mark. "I'm sure a judge would be fascinated by your defense. My client has her husband very much alive on a notarized video confession." This was a bluff, but a brilliant one. How would they know for sure? The 72 hours passed. Then, true to his word, had a courier deliver the packages to the various government agencies. The trap had been sprung. A formal investigation was opened almost immediately. This is when I made my only move. It wasn't on Ben's advice, it was all my own. I went to the cemetery. It was a crisp, clear day, the leaves on the maple trees turning brilliant shades of red and gold. I stood before the polished granite headstone that bore my husband's name, Richard Miller, beloved husband and father, 1956-2023. It was a lie, carved in stone. I wasn't there to mourn, I was there to wait. I knew, with a certainty that settled deep in my bones, that sooner or later they would get desperate enough to try to talk to me in person. An hour later, Sarah's Lexus pulled up. She got out of the car looking haggard and worn. The designer clothes looked like a costume on her now. She walked toward me, her face streaked with tears. "Mom," she began, her voice hoarse, "please, you have to stop this. You have to call it off." I didn't look at her. I just stared at the name on the headstone. Call what off, Sarah? A criminal investigation into a major felony? I don't think that's how it works. You can't just unring a bell. You could tell them you were mistaken, that you were confused, that you're a grieving old woman who got overwhelmed. And there it was, the narrative they'd always relied on. The story where I was the weak one, the confused one, the emotional, hysterical woman who didn't understand the big decisions the men were making. The rage that had been simmering inside me for days finally boiled over. I turned to her, my voice low and sharp. I am not confused, I am not weak, and I am not a fool.
You stood here at this very spot and you threw a handful of dirt on an empty box and you cried into my shoulder. You let me believe my life was over. You and that weasel you married and that coward you call a father did this, not me. Every single thing that is happening to you right now is a consequence of your own actions. You don't get to blame me for it." She flinched as if I slapped her. For the first time, she was speechless. "Now," I said, my voice hardening into something I didn't even recognize, "you're going to go home. You're going to tell your father and your husband that I am willing to talk to the district attorney. I will consider telling him that I believe you were a victim, coerced into this scheme by two manipulative men, and that your only crime was being a loyal daughter." A flicker of hope ignited in her eyes. "You would? Oh, Mom, you would?" "I might," I said, letting the word hang in the air. "It depends on how cooperative your father is, because my offer doesn't extend to him or to Mark. They built this house of cards. I'm just here to watch it fall." I left her there, standing between a fake grave and the real-world consequences of her choices. As I walked back to my car, I knew I had them. Richard's greatest weakness was always his paternal instinct toward Sarah. He'd do anything to protect her, and I was about to use that to my complete and total advantage. I didn't have to wait long for the other shoe to drop. It was 9 o'clock that night when my phone rang. The caller ID said Sarah, but the voice on the other end was Richard's. It was the first time I'd heard his voice over the phone in over a year, and the sound of it sent a jolt, not of nostalgia, but of pure disgust right through me. He sounded old, tired, and desperate. "Helen, please don't hang up," he started, his voice a pathetic wheeze. "Sarah told me what you said, what you offered to do for her." "I haven't offered anything," I replied, my voice as cold and flat as a frozen lake. I merely pointed out a potential strategy she might want to consider. I was in my kitchen, calmly wiping down the counters. I wanted him to picture me doing something mundane, completely untroubled, while his world was burning down around him.
"She's a good kid, Helen. She got pulled into something that was over her head," he pleaded. "It was me and Mark. It was our idea. She went along to keep the family together." "The family?" I scoffed. "The family was you and me, Richard. We were the family. You set fire to it for a pile of cash, and she held the gasoline." I could hear shouting in the background, Mark, no doubt, then Sarah, crying. The beautiful facade of their perfect life had cracked wide open, and the vermin were scurrying in the light. "Mark's on his way to your house," Richard blurted out. He's not thinking straight. He's furious. He thinks he can bully you into backing down. Please, Helen, just don't open the door. He's what, Richard? Going to threaten a 66-year-old widow? Don't worry about me. I've already called the local police department. I told them I was a victim of a fraud scheme and that the perpetrator, my son-in-law, was unhinged and had made veiled threats. I let them know he might be stopping by. There's a squad car parked just down the street. So you tell me, how do you think that's going to play out for him?" The silence on the end of the line was profound. I had checkmated him and he knew it. A few minutes later, I got a text from my neighbor across the street. "Helen, you won't believe this. A black Cadillac just tore down our street, slammed on its brakes in front of your house, and then a police car flashed its lights and the caddy sped off like a bat out of hell. Is everything okay?" I smiled. "Everything is just fine, Mary," I texted back. "Just a little family drama." The next morning, Ben Carter called them. Not Sarah or Richard, but their new high-priced lawyer. The offer to meet was extended. My terms were simple. Richard would be present. He would tell the entire truth from start to finish. In exchange for this cooperation and a few other small conditions, I would instruct my lawyer to inform the DA of my belief that Sarah was coerced. It wasn't a guarantee she'd get off, Ben warned me, but a mother's testimony carries a lot of weight. The meeting was held in Ben's conference room 2 days later. It was a large, intimidating room on the 30th floor of a downtown skyscraper with a panoramic view of the city I barely noticed. I sat on one side of a ridiculously long, polished mahogany table with Ben. They sat on the other side.
Richard, Sarah, and their lawyer, a tired-looking man who seemed already to regret taking the case. Mark was conspicuously absent. Their lawyer had advised he stay far, far away. Richard looked like he'd aged 10 years. His skin was gray, his shoulders slumped. He wouldn't meet my eyes. Sarah just looked broken, her face puffy from crying. Seeing them like that, stripped of all their smugness and wealth, I felt nothing. Not pity, not even hatred, just a profound, empty disappointment. The people I had loved the most had been replaced by these two hollowed-out shells of greed and cowardice. "All right," Ben started, his voice booming in the quiet room. "Richard, my client has made a generous and frankly undeserved offer. It begins with you telling the truth, the full truth. No omissions, no spin. Start from the beginning. Whose idea was this?" Richard swallowed hard, his eyes flickering towards Sarah for a moment. He took a deep breath, and the confession began. It was even more sordid than I'd imagined. Mark had apparently been in deep financial trouble, with bad investments and loan sharks. He'd seen Richard's boring but stable life savings as a way out. He was the one who found the crooked doctor. He was the one who coached Sarah on what to say to me. He masterminded the entire thing. Richard, for his part, was a willing co-conspirator, terrified of a meager retirement and seduced by the promise of easy money. His confession was rambling, pathetic, and filled with self-pitying excuses about market downturns and wanting to provide. He painted himself as a man who was just trying to do right by his family, a story so full of holes it wouldn't have held water in a colander. I let him talk until he was finished. I didn't interrupt. I just watched. I made him see me watching him reduce our 41 years together into a grubby little financial calculation. They thought this was the hard part. They thought the confession was the price of admission. They had no idea that Ben and I weren't just there to listen. We were there to dictate the terms of their unconditional surrender.
And just when he thought he had me backed into a corner, he forgot who he was dealing with. Stick with me because you'll want to see how this plays out. When Richard's pathetic monologue finally dribbled to a stop, his lawyer cleared his throat and looked at Ben. "Okay, you have the confession. I trust you'll be in communication with the district attorney regarding our client, Sarah Miller." Ben leaned forward, placing his hands flat on the table, and gave him that shark's smile I was becoming so fond of. "We're not quite finished," he said smoothly. He slid a thick stack of documents across the table. "This," he announced, "is a civil settlement agreement. My client has endured more than a year of profound emotional distress as a direct result of a conspiracy to commit fraud, a conspiracy in which all three of you were active participants. She is entitled to damages, substantial damages." Their lawyer picked up the top page. His eyebrows shot up. "This is absurd. You're asking for everything." "Not everything," Ben corrected him. "Just everything that was purchased with the fraudulent insurance money. The house, the cars, any remaining funds in any account, domestic or offshore. It will all be placed in a trust, which my client will control. You will sign over the titles and the deeds. Today." "That's impossible," Sarah cried out. "Where will we live?" I finally spoke, looking directly at her for the first time. "I don't know, Sarah. You could have lived in your old house. You could have lived a normal life. You chose this. As for where you'll live now, that sounds like a problem for Mark to solve. I hear the rental market is terrible." Richard stared at me, his mouth agape. "Helen, that money was for my retirement. It was for our future." "You don't have a future with me, Richard," I said, my voice cutting through his denial. "You made that decision when you decided you were worth more to me dead than alive." Their lawyer began to bluster about fighting it in court. Ben just laughed. "Please do," he said, gesturing around the room. "Imagine this testimony in open court. Imagine the press. Your client Mark's career is already over. This would ensure he never works in finance again. Sarah's reputation in her little gated community would be shredded. And Richard, well, after he serves his time for fraud, he'll have nothing left anyway. My client is offering you the clean, quiet way out. Take everything you've built this past year, your entire castle of lies, and sign it over to the woman you victimized. In exchange, she will keep this civil matter out of the press and focus her cooperation with the DA solely on the criminal aspect. It was brilliant. He was leveraging their shame against them. He was offering them a choice: public humiliation and total financial ruin, or quiet, private financial ruin. Richard looked at Sarah, whose face was buried in her hands. He looked at the legal documents that would sign away his imagined future. He looked at me, sitting across from him, my expression unreadable. In that moment, he finally understood. He hadn't just lost his money. He had lost his daughter's respect, he had lost his freedom, and he had lost the one person who had stood by him for 40 years. He was utterly, completely defeated. He picked up the pen. It was a heavy, expensive fountain pen from Ben's desk. The scratch of the nib on the paper was the only found in the room. He signed the first page, then the next, and the next. He signed over the house. He signed over the title to his portion of the offshore accounts. He signed a full confession that named Mark as the architect of the entire scheme. He was throwing his son-in-law to the wolves to save his daughter. It was the only fatherly thing he'd done in over a year. When he was done, he pushed the papers back across the table. His hand was shaking. "Is that all?" he whispered. Ben gathered the documents, tapping them into a neat pile. "For today, yes." He stood up, signaling the end of the meeting. "We will be in touch." As I stood to leave, I paused and looked at the man I once called my husband. "By the way, Richard, that headstone, the plot, it was very expensive. I paid for it out of our joint savings account. I expect to be reimbursed." I didn't wait for a reply. I walked out of that conference room and didn't look back. The war wasn't over, but the most important battle had just been won. I hadn't just gotten the money back. I had taken back the control they had stolen from me. They had wanted a quiet, comfortable future, and I had just signed the eviction notice. The weeks following that meeting were a whirlwind of legal filings and asset transfers. True to his word, Ben Carter was ruthlessly efficient. The 5-bedroom monstrosity in the estates at Willow Creek was signed over to the trust I controlled. The Lexus SUV and the black Cadillac were retitled. Ben's forensic accountants, a team of what he called his financial bloodhounds, chased down every last dollar that had been squirreled away in offshore accounts in the Caymans and Switzerland. It turned out, Richard, for all his accounting acumen, was a novice at hiding money from true professionals. I never set foot in that big, soulless house again. I told the real estate agent Ben hired to sell it, and to sell it fast. Sell all the new furniture with it. "I don't want a single thing that was bought with my tears," I told him. He found a cash buyer within 2 weeks, a tech executive who was more interested in the square footage than the bad karma. The cars were sold at auction. Bit by bit, the symbols of their betrayal were liquidated and converted into a simple, clean number in a bank account. My bank account. The legal fallout for them was, in a word, catastrophic. Just as he'd planned, Mark took the brunt of the criminal charges. Richard's detailed confession, combined with Mark's arrogance and refusal to cooperate, made him the perfect villain for the DA's office. He was charged with multiple counts of fraud and conspiracy. His boys' club investment firm cut him loose permanently, and the public nature of the charges meant his name was mud in the financial world. He was ruined, professionally and personally. Richard, having cooperated, received a more lenient sentence. But he didn't escape punishment. He pleaded guilty to insurance fraud and was sentenced to 5 years in a minimum security federal prison. A man who was terrified of a meager retirement would now be spending his golden years in a jumpsuit, eating government-issue Salisbury steak. The irony was not lost on me. And Sarah. Sarah got what I had promised. I held up my end of the bargain. Through Ben, I communicated to the DA that I truly believed she had been manipulated and pressured by her husband and father. I mentioned her age, her young son, her lack of financial sophistication. It worked. The DA, seeing he had a slam-dunk case against the two men, allowed Sarah to plead to a lesser charge, a misdemeanor. She received no jail time, only 5 years of probation and 1,000 hours of community service. In many ways, though, her punishment was the most profound. She lost her father to prison. She lost her husband as she filed for divorce shortly after he was indicted. She lost her home, her friends, and every last shred of the lavish life she so desperately craved. And, most of all, she had lost her mother. Our relationship was shattered, perhaps irreparably. She would call sometimes, her voice small and tentative. "Hi, Mom, it's me." She tried to apologize once. "I'm so sorry, Mom. I was stupid. I know that now." But her apologies felt like they were for getting caught, not for the act itself. She still didn't grasp the sheer, soul-crushing depth of the pain she had caused. How do you forgive someone who helped bury you alive? I didn't have an answer. For my own peace of mind, I kept my distance. A few months after the house was sold and the money was settled, I did one last thing. I hired a company to exhume the empty casket from the cemetery plot. It was a surreal experience, watching a backhoe dig up the proof of a lie I had lived for over a year. I had the ridiculously expensive oak box splintered and incinerated. Then I sold the burial plot. Richard would have to make other arrangements.
So here I am. It's been about 2 years since I heard that cough coming from the basement. I'm sitting on the screened-in porch of a lovely little house in Scottsdale, Arizona. I sold the old house in Ohio and moved down here to be closer to my sister Carol. The sun is warm, the air is dry, and for the first time in a very long time, my life is my own. The trust Ben set up for me is more than enough to live on, comfortably, for the rest of my days. But it's not about the money. It never really was. It was about justice. It was about taking back the narrative. They saw me as a supporting character in their story of greed, the sad, fragile widow. They never imagined I would become the author of their downfall. They thought my love for them was a weakness they could exploit. They didn't understand that a love that deep, when betrayed, can forge a strength as hard as steel. They underestimated me. They saw an old woman, and they forgot that old women have a lifetime of experience, wisdom, and a profound, unshakable knowledge of what is right and what is wrong. They thought my grief had made me weak, but in the end, it was the fire that tempered my resolve. Richard will be out of prison in a few years. Mark will likely serve longer. Sarah is rebuilding her life from scratch somewhere in a small town, working a menial job, a shadow of the person she tried to be. Sometimes I wonder if they ever think about me. I wonder if they finally understand the magnitude of what they did, the line they crossed. I don't hate them. Hate is a heavy burden, and I'm done carrying other people's baggage. What I feel is a quiet, settled peace, a sense of vindication. I'm living the comfortable retirement Richard was so afraid of losing. I'm just living it without him. I took the ugliest betrayal a person can suffer, and I turned it into a new beginning. I survived. I fought back, and I won. Now it's your turn. After hearing all of this, let me know in the comments. What would you have done in my place?
Your watch to the end. Be click here. You will hear another story from my grandma.